Story 1. Growing up, I had a best friend named Lloyd. We grew up as regular country boys having all sorts of fun. We collected baseball cards together, we played with our toy guns, went to the pool, and did just about everything together. When my dad took me hunting for the first time, Lloyd came along. So growing up, we really just did about everything together. This happened when the two of us were in high school. Lloyd and I both lived off a rural route, way out of town. This was a very poor area, and we both lived in pretty old, run-down houses. This was in the 1980s. We had grown up in the 70s and early 80s. My family was fortunate enough to have a color television, but we didn't have anything like cable. But this didn't matter too much to us kids, because of the stuff we did was outside. It was a really hot summer night when this happened. Lloyd was over at my house, which was usual. We were both 16 years old at the time. We had been in my room listening to music pretty much all night. After a while, though, we had begun to get a little bored. Lloyd wanted to smoke a couple joints that he had on him. He thought that we could get away with it in my room, but there was no way I would let him. I wouldn't take the chance of my dad smelling it. I don't really know if we would have gotten in trouble for it or not, but there was no way that I was going to take a chance. We lived right on the edge of a huge forest. It was a place that we had explored in, hunted in, hanged out in, and even smoked joints in before. I let Lloyd know that if he wanted to smoke, then we should probably go for a walk in the woods. It was already past midnight, but that was no big deal. We had often gone for walks really late at night. My dad was still awake and watching television. We let him know that we were bored and were going to go for a walk. He didn't care, just told us to be careful, but just take a flashlight with us. He also suggested I take my rifle out with me, which I decided to do just to make him happy. This was back in the 1980s, and we lived in an extremely rural area, so it wasn't unusual for a kid my age to have his own gun. So we set out. We began smoking as soon as we got out into the woods. It was extremely dark outside, so we began using the flashlight right away. There were some paths to walk on, created by years of people simply walking through the big forest, and we just walked along them, deeper and deeper into the trees. For a while into our walk, it was just a normal walk. We didn't have anything happen or hear anything out of the ordinary. But after a while, we noticed something lying off to the side of the path that we were on. When we got closer, we were pretty shocked by what he had seen. There was a dead deer lying on the ground. This in itself was not unusual, but it was cut up pretty bad. It was like some animal had killed it and mauled it a bit, eating a lot of it in the area that it was wounded in. What was weird, though, was that plenty of the edible parts of the deer were left over. It seemed strange to both of us that any animal would have done this and left so much meat. "Hey, what if we run into a bobcat or something that did this?" Lloyd asked me. I held up my rifle. "That's what we have this for," I said. Don't misunderstand me, however. I wouldn't go looking for a bobcat to kill, but I would absolutely use my rifle to protect myself from one, however. We didn't think a whole lot about it and kept walking through the woods and smoking. Except now, we were listening to the noises around us more closely. We were talking about the possibility of a bobcat, and I guess the more we talked about it, the more we convinced ourselves that there might be one out there. However, we absolutely were not scared. I don't know how long we were out or when we decided to turn around and head back toward my house. But we eventually did, and it was probably pretty late. We were probably pretty stoned at that point too, but not more than we were used to being. It was on the way back that Lloyd began getting a little paranoid. He kept telling me that he was hearing things in the woods. I wasn't hearing any of the noises that he described, and I told him he was just stoned. But he was confident that he heard something out there. He was confident that he heard something walking out in the woods. He began getting really worried that a bobcat or another animal was out there and was stalking us. I, though, didn't hear the noises that he had been talking about. The more we walked along, the more paranoid that Lloyd got. He kept asking me, whispering over and over, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" And I hadn't heard any of the things that he had been talking about. When we crossed back toward the area that we originally had seen the deer, we were surprised to see that it wasn't there. This just increased Lloyd's paranoia, and he began scanning the area, trying to see if an animal was dragging it off somewhere. "Holy shit," I heard his whisper, and he grabbed my arm. Lloyd made me look over into the woods, but he wouldn't shine the flashlight in that direction. Although it was dark, I could see what looked like a rather large figure out in the woods. It was moving too. I grabbed the flashlight from him and shined it over at whatever it was that we were looking at. We saw the deer, but whatever the big figure was, that obviously was pulling it, quickly got out of the way before we could see what it was. However, we had both seen it. For the first time, I was as scared as Lloyd was, or even more. I didn't know who or what we saw, but after what we remembered from seeing the deer, and then what we had seen in the dark, I knew someone or something was out there. To let them know that we were armed, I took my rifle and I shot one shot into the air. I was hoping that would scare whomever it was away. "We need to get out of here," Lloyd told me. I agreed, and the two of us began jogging along the path to get out of the woods. We were scared that anything that might have killed that deer and was pulling it away could be frighteningly dangerous. We just wanted to get as far away from it as possible. We weren't aware if it tried following us, but we got out of the woods as fast as we could. What we had seen was not very far from my house, so we both rushed into the house and locked the doors behind us. It was hot outside, and we usually kept the doors open, and they were always unlocked. So, this was a rare thing. The two of us went and hid out in my room. We kept the gun out with us, fully loaded. We didn't sleep at all that night. I guess that shouldn't really be surprising. About a month later, a really big guy was arrested in the woods not far from our house. Apparently, he had attacked a police officer who had stopped to question him. I have no doubt that it was the same man. Story 2. I used to always enjoy taking my dog on a walk through the woods every day. I lived out in the country by myself. For the most part, when I took my dog for a walk, I would take him through the same area every time. However, one day I decided to travel out in a completely different direction, and that resulted in me seeing the strangest thing I had ever seen in my life. It was nothing more than a decision made out of boredom. But I took my dog alongside the dirt roads past the driveway and then out into the hills that were opposite my house. Like my normal walks, we were out for a long time. We weren't hunting or anything, but my dog and I liked to take really long walks in the country as if we were. I didn't even have to leash him, as he never went too far from me and always came back. Besides being a little more dense than the forest that we usually walked along in, this wasn't much different than that. We were having a good time walking through the woods and enjoying what we were seeing. My dog, I forgot to mention that his name is Roscoe, had been running around looking at things. He had beaten me over the top of the hill, and I was trying to get up there to check on him. But before I even made it to the top, he came running back over the hill to me. When he caught up to me, he turned and tried to lead me up the hill all over again. "Did you find something interesting, boy?" I asked him. Roscoe turned and began running back over the hill. I stepped up my pace and made it over the hill to see where he was going. Once I made it over the hill, I noticed something that really surprised me. There looked like there was an old cabin on the other side of the hill. And since Roscoe was over right by the cabin, I figured that was what he was barking about. I really didn't want to bother anyone who was living out in the woods like that. I knew better than to get involved with them. So I tried calling Roscoe over and over, trying to get him to come back to me. But for some reason, he wouldn't. It wasn't unusual for him, however, to not come when I called him. He could be a bit stubborn at times. I was very nervous when I walked up to him. He was barking or anything, so it was possible that anyone living in the cabin hadn't heard him out there. So I did my best to be as quiet as possible, and I tried to go up to Roscoe so I could grab him by the collar and lead him away. As I got up to him, I looked over to the side of the cabin that I hadn't seen before. I noticed something really strange. There was a tree that was really close to the side of the cabin. Hanging from this tree were all sorts of shoes. They were all pairs of shoes, some of them in many different sizes. They all had their strings tied together, and then the strings were tied to different branches on the tree. Most of them looked like they had been up on the tree for a long time, beaten by the weather. However, some of the shoes in the tree looked like they were put there more recently and were not as weathered. All in all, it was the weirdest thing that I had ever seen before. Also, the most disturbing thing I had ever seen. I tried to be as quiet as I could as I led Roscoe away from the area. I thought if I led him down the hill, we would get to the road and I could just take that back home. As we kept going down the hill, though, I kept smelling something pretty nasty. It just got worse and worse until we got to the bottom of the hill. And at the bottom, I saw the most disgusting thing I had ever seen in my life. There was like a pile of what appeared to be rotted and decaying roadkill or something on the bottom of that hill. It was vile, and I had to do everything I could to keep from puking. I just had Roscoe by the collar and led him away from it. We eventually got back to the dirt road. I used it and took my dog home with me. I don't know what I actually saw that day. Between the weird shoe tree and the pile of roadkill, it was just the weirdest shit. But then again, a lot of times if you go hiking where you're not supposed to, you will see the weirdest shit. Story 3. I inherited my parents' home when they both passed away when I was in my early 20s. I wasn't in a relationship and didn't have any children, so I moved in alone. It was a pretty big house to live in alone, but I didn't want to get rid of it or sell it or anything. So I stayed in it for quite a long time by myself. So I was a single female living in a big house in town all by myself. My next door neighbors, or at least the ones who owned the house, didn't live there. However, they rented the house out to several people throughout the time that I had been alive. I had neighbors that I played with their children while growing up, and also had people who lived there who we never spoke to at all. And when I owned the house, not much changed. Well, about 2 years after I inherited the house, the people who rented the house next door moved out, and it stayed empty for about a month or so. When someone finally moved in, I came outside onto the porch to see who it was. I always liked to greet whoever moved in. Like my house, it was a big 3-bedroom, family-sized home, so I expected a family moving in. When I went over to greet the man who was moving in, I quickly realized that he was moving in all by himself. He didn't have a family moving in, and it wasn't surprising why. There was something very off and something very creepy about the guy that I noticed right away. He absolutely wasn't very talkative at all and kept looking at me in a way that made me very uncomfortable. When I excused myself and went back to my home, I just decided this was not going to be one of the more friendly neighborhood relationships that I was going to have. But it didn't bother me because I figured that, like most of these neighbors over the years, he wouldn't be here forever anyway. So things just continued to be strange with him as the weeks passed. He wouldn't really talk to me, but if I came out of the house and he was on his porch, he would stare at me the entire time that I was outside. His eyes would follow me to my car and watch me as I drove away. I guess I should have worried about him breaking into my house and maybe stealing stuff, but I never did. I could always tell from his eyes that this was not what was important to him. He seemed like he was interested in me for some reason. So after time, things kept up like that. I came to the conclusion that he was pretty harmless. But not so long after that, I had seen him watching me from the windows of his house whenever he could catch a glimpse of me. That was much creepier than him just watching me from his porch, but I still tried not to think about it too much. Then, one night, about 7 months after I moved in, I had gotten home pretty late from work. I just wanted to have a couple glasses of wine and take a bath. I was doing a good job at finally relaxing after a very stressful workday. My bathroom was on the second floor of the house. So, after I was done with my bath, I dried off and then put on my robe. I decided to go down to the second floor and get myself another glass of wine. I was walking around in the dark, like I normally do. I have very good night vision. I got the bottle out of the refrigerator and poured a glass, keeping the door open. And then I replaced the bottle inside. When the door was open, it faced the back of my house and blocked my back door. I closed it, and the kitchen, of course, went dark again when the light went out. After the couple of seconds it took for my eyes to adjust, I saw something out of the back window. It was only for a few moments, but I was sure of it. It was a man who was looking in the back window of my house, and there was no doubt at all that it was my next-door neighbor. Then, within a moment, he was gone. I didn't scream or anything, but I did grab my phone and I called the police. I let them know exactly what I had seen. Well, I didn't have any proof that the man was at my back door. But in a moment of irony, I really didn't need it. The scariest revelation of my life also ended up being the thing that helped me. The police revealed to me that my neighbor was a convicted sex offender. But the reason they didn't need proof that he was at my door to arrest him was because he hadn't registered as one even long before he moved in. So he went to jail and was evicted as my neighbor. I was scared to death when I was told this by the police. It made me think of the possibilities with a person like that living next door. It was a good thing I caught him when I did. Story 3. In the late 70s, I recall visiting our grandparents' house. They lived in a holler about a 20-minute drive away from the nearest town. When going to their house, you would turn off a main road onto a rocky road, and I always knew the turn was coming because there was a little mom-and-pop type store on the side of the road. This store was really the sort of thing that you would never see nowadays. It was a very small, old gray building. There was a very old drink cooler sitting on the porch, and it was very small inside. There was a counter, some small coolers, and shelves with some simple groceries on them. It was truly the definition of what a small country store was. By the counter, they had boxes of candy that cost 10 cents, if I remember it correctly. My cousins and I used to always walk down to the store and buy boxes of candy whenever we had a dime or two on us. And that was what was going on this day. I was 10 years old at the time, and my cousin was the same age as me, basically. We decided to walk down the road to the store and get some pop and get some candy. Now, it was a little bit of a walk, and it took us a little time to get there. But it wasn't something that we hadn't done before. But this time, something very different happened. A car pulled up the street with an older guy in the driver's seat. He stopped by us and asked us what we were doing. We had never seen the guy before, and we knew a lot of the people in this area. We simply told him that we were going down to the store to get some candy. Well, the guy insisted that he let us drive him to the store. My cousin and I enjoyed the walk, and we knew that we didn't get in the car with people that we didn't know. We turned him down, but he kept trying to get us to get in the car with him for a while. Finally, giving up, the man, who was downright creepy, drove off. Now, the little store didn't really have a parking lot. A couple cars could park out front of it at any time. When we got close, we saw that the guy from the car was not only parked there, but he was sitting on the porch swing drinking a tall bottle of mellow yellow. When we got to the store, he tried talking to us again, letting us know that he would be happy to drive us home once we were done in the store. Well, my cousin and I were extremely uncomfortable. The guy was just so persistent and so creepy that we wouldn't even consider it under any circumstances. But as we walked into the store, the man said, "I'll be waiting for you." We told the shop owner what was going on. I can't recall her name, but she was immediately concerned. She called our parents, and my dad drove down to the store to pick us up. Apparently, when my dad showed up, the man got into his car and left. We found out when we got older that this man was accused several times of doing things to boys that lived in the area. I really believe it based off the way that he was behaving. I don't know what would have happened if we got into the car, but I know it couldn't have been good. Story 4. This is a hard story to tell for a couple of reasons. First off, I was really young when this story happened, so the memory is not the greatest in the world. My parents have told the story to refresh my memory, but they tell it differently even between each other. The second reason I will tell you at the end of the story. I was 6 years old, and I was definitely a mama's boy. I followed my mom everywhere and always wanted her attention. I remained like this throughout her entire life. Well, when I was 6, a cousin of mine named Ethan moved in with us. His parents had recently died in a fire, and his mom was my mom's sister. So my mom took him in, and when he did, everything changed very dramatically. Ethan barely ever talked. I guess that is pretty normal for a kid who just lost his parents. Not only that, but he lived in town. I won't mention where this happened, but for the record, it is not the United States. And we lived in the country. I imagine that he had friends that he could go out and play with all of the time. But we lived far away in a house that wasn't close enough to other houses to know anyone. I was the only one that Ethan had to play with. But Ethan wouldn't play. He wouldn't go outside with me and try to climb trees or things like that. He wouldn't play board games or anything at all. What he did do, however, was something that I definitely didn't like. Ethan was super attached to my mother, and I didn't like that at all. Being a mama's boy, I wanted all of her attention. But Ethan would follow here around. Sometimes he would hold her skirt with his hand, as if he was trying to keep her from getting away. If my mom or I tried to get him to stop doing this, he would start screaming and crying. Everyone thought it was just easier to let him do what he was doing. And the entire time, it made me really mad. I was really young and probably too young to go out and explore the woods. But with Ethan being around my mom all the time, it was really the only thing that I had to do. So one day, which was actually a pretty weird day, I went out in the woods to have a look around. Being out there was a lot more enjoyable than I thought it would be. The sky was covered with dark thunderclouds, and I was in danger of getting caught in a storm. However, I really loved the atmosphere of the darkness during the day. The wind and the occasional bolt of lightning and crack of thunder that would pierce the darkness of the storm. I don't know how long I was out there really, and at first I didn't care. I just wanted to be by myself. However, when I decided to go home, I had no idea how to get there. I tried walking back the way that I came, but I couldn't be sure which way I had come from. I hadn't taken the time to look at any landmarks that would remind me of the way out of the place. I was too young at the time to even think of that. The only Lost in the Woods story I had ever heard was Hansel and Gretel, and I didn't have crumbs of bread to lay down so I could remember my path. I wasn't worried at first. I thought it would be easy to find my way home. I only had to keep walking the same amount of time that I walked into the woods, and that would lead me out of the woods. My 6-year-old mind accepted this as fact, as silly as it might seem nowadays. Well, my idea didn't work, and the storm kept brewing and brewing. I was expecting it to break at any moment, and that scared me too. I am not scared of storms, but I had never been out in one before. The idea of doing that is what scared me. Fortunately, despite the fact that it seemed like it would storm at any moment, it didn't start raining. For that, I was very thankful. I kept thinking that I would get even more lost by the minute, and I would never find my way home. I thought about bobcats and coyotes, animals that we knew were in the area, and the idea scared the hell out of me. Even if the animals didn't get me at first, I didn't have any food. Once I came across a creek and I drank a little water from it, but that was really all that there was. My young mind was convinced that I was definitely going to die out there. Then I saw something in the distance. It was smoke. I immediately thought that someone, possibly even my father, had made some sort of bonfire. Even if it was not my dad, it could be someone who would take me back to my family. So I walked in the direction of the smoke. I was a lot less scared than I had been before. I knew I was going to get out of the woods and everything would be okay. I even remember smiling and running a little toward the smoke. As I got closer, I realized that the smoke was definitely coming from my yard. I thought maybe my parents were worried that I had gotten lost in the woods, and they made the smoke as a signal to help me get home. I was happy, and I sprinted the rest of the way back into the yard of my house. My heart dropped, though, when I got close enough to actually see what was going on. No one had built a bonfire to help me find my way out of the woods. The house that I lived in for my entire life was on fire. And it wasn't just any small fire. The entire house was completely engulfed in flames. I stopped in the woods, looking at the most horrifying scene that I had ever seen in my life. I didn't know what to think until I saw my family standing in the yard. My parents were there, and Ethan was standing beside my mom as always. I ran out of the woods directly toward my parents. My mom grabbed me and hugged me. She hadn't known that I had gone out in the woods, and she thought that I had been hiding in the house somewhere. She thought I possibly could be dead, and she was absolutely terrified until she noticed me coming out of the woods. The fire department came, but it didn't really matter that much. There wasn't a lot they could do, as there were no hydrants out in the country. The truck had a tank of water, if I remember right. But it didn't stop our home from burning right down to its foundation. The official report was that the house was burned down by accident. However, even being 6 years old, I didn't accept that. It seemed too weird to me. Ethan's parents died in a house fire. Less than 3 months after he came to live with us, our house caught on fire, but no one died. It seemed like an awfully weird coincidence to me. Yeah, I think Ethan burned his house and killed his parents. I think he burned down our house and maybe tried to kill us. But I kept this thought to myself for many years. Ethan is on the autism spectrum, which I think might explain his behavior with my mom. I don't think it has anything to do with him burning down houses, though, so please don't think that. I think separate from his autism, he is just an evil little fuck. My grandma took him in and adopted him basically after that. I only saw Ethan when we went to visit my maternal grandma. I was glad he was gone. No other houses burned, so maybe I was wrong about him. I don't think so, though. Story 5. I grew up as sort of an only child with my mother. My father and her were not together, but I don't want to go too deep into that. Although my mother never had any kids, my father eventually had a boy and a girl, so I had 2 half-siblings who were about 10 and 8 years younger than I was. I occasionally would do things with my dad, such as staying with him for a week or so here and there. It was nice to see my brother and sister grow up, and sometimes we went on hiking and camping trips, and that was always pretty fun. Well, it wasn't always that fun. There was one time when it wasn't fun at all. That's the story that I am going to tell. We had what you would call a sort of close call. We went out camping by the river on a sandbar. I was 16 years old at the time. My brother was 8 years old and my sister was 6. We had 3 tents set up on the sandbar. There was one for my dad, one for me, and one for my siblings to share. We were going to be there for a few days and try our luck at fishing in the river. Everything was set up really good. My dad and I gathered wood and we made a good bonfire. We got some coals going to start cooking some of the fish that we caught. Fishing was something all 4 of us could do, although it was only my dad who caught anything that we were able to actually eat. It seems like a bit of a waste to try and cook minnows. While we were cooking, we heard something down the river. It took a little bit, but we noticed a boat coming down the river. The people in the boat were acting really loud and rowdy, making tons of noise and such. Even before they got close to us, my dad and I figured out that they must have been really drunk. When they got close to us, we saw that they were all college-age kids. When they noticed us, they started waving and such. Then they steered the boat toward the sandbar that we were camping on. They anchored the boat by the sandbar, a little ways up from where we were camping. So, at first I thought that they were just going to make their own camp and have no involvement with us. How wrong I was. It was two couples and a single guy. They were all drunk and maybe stoned off of their asses. But the single guy was the drunkest one of all. I couldn't figure out how the guy was even able to stand. He was so way out of it. They were playing loud music and still acting rowdy. They brought their boombox and their beer, and they eventually came over to our bonfire. They joined us there, and we didn't say anything. My dad was in his late 40s, and I was 16, but we knew that we had to be careful with a bunch of drunken students. Alcohol can change a person dramatically. My dad and I talked with them, mostly just to keep them happy. After a while, though, one of the couples asked to borrow one of the tents. Before anyone could say anything, I offered my tent. I had a good idea of why they wanted the tent, and figured I better offer mine before one of the younger kids decided to offer their own. They were in the tent for about 3 minutes. Just a side note from the story right now, but if you are going to bone, why would you only do it for 3 minutes? I mean, what could you possibly accomplish in 3 minutes? The other couple were pretty shit-faced, and I was wondering how they couldn't pass out. In fact, several times their eyes would close and they would sway a bit. Still, they wouldn't pass out quite yet. The single guy, who was even drunker than they were, was the one that scared me the most, though. He had a big hunting knife that was sheathed and strapped onto his belt. I had been keeping an eye on him the whole time in case he decided to use it. He did take it out, and I was about to do something, but he walked away from us. There was a tree stump out on the edge of the sandbar, and he went over to it. He kept throwing the knife at it over and over again. My dad had a fillet knife to use for the fish. It was the sharpest knife I had ever seen in my life. He kept it hidden on him the whole time. I went and got the hatchet that we used to chop the wood, and I kept it close to me at all times. I decided I knew what I had to do. I went to all of the tents, and I took the sleeping bags out of them. I do wish I had taken my sleeping bag out before I allowed those two to go at it in my tent, but well, I moved all of the bags to my dad's tent. We were all going to sleep in there. The kids were confused because I don't think they knew what was going on at all. They complained because they wanted their own tent, but I made them stop. The 5 college students then decided to go play in the water. They were swimming around and splashing and such. A couple of them started cussing, and 2 of the guys, the single guy and one of the couples, began to fight a bit. I don't know how bad the fighting was. I was trying to pay as little attention to them as possible. We just all went into out tent when it was dark enough. We had lights to read books, but it was really hard the whole time. They kept playing loud music, whooping and cussing and doing who knows what. At one point, we noticed shadows. 2 of the students had come remarkably close to our tent, and it seemed like they were fighting again. I still had my hatchet, and I was totally prepared to use it if I had to. One of the guys stumbled and nearly fell on the tent, but he was able to compose himself. My brother and sister somehow were able to fall asleep, but my dad and I remained awake. We listened for hours as they partied, argued, cussed, and fought. Eventually, around 4 a.m., I heard the boat start and listened as it rode away. Finally, I was able to get a little bit of sleep. When we got up in the morning, we noticed that one of our coolers had been thrown into the fire. The other 2 tents had been trampled on and were leveled. Fortunately, that was the only thing they did, and none of us got hurt. You never know what people do when their state is altered. I am not judging, though. Hell, later in my life, I partied harder than they did, and that was only a few years later. Story 6. I always thought my grandma was really weird. I never liked visiting her house when I was a kid. She wasn't one of the typical grandmas that love their grandchildren, bake cookies, etc. My grandma was very anal about her house. She never seemed to like having the kids over because she was afraid that we would break things. It wasn't really until I was a teenager that she seemed to trust me being over at the house at all. But even then, she had a rule about not touching anything she had there. You couldn't read her books, you couldn't touch her knickknacks, and don't even wonder how protective of her paintings she was. And you know, I understand on some level. I can't say that I would want to be like her, and I never have, but her house was her house, and she had every right to be as overprotective as she wanted to be. Still, I hated it. My grandma passed away and we never had the occasion to become close to each other. However, she did will some of her things to all of us. Surprisingly, she willed the house to me. I could only guess it was because I was the only one of her family who didn't own a home. But she also willed her knickknacks, paintings, and books to me and insisted in the will that I keep all of them in the home like she wanted. Well, I appreciated what she did. Still, I didn't want all of that stuff in the house. I didn't like it, and now that the house was mine, I wanted to make it the best that I could. I took some boxes and began taking all of her stuff down. I took very good care of it. I wrapped the knickknacks in bubble wrap before I put them in the box. Even though I didn't have a close relationship with my grandma and I didn't like her stuff, I still wanted to take the best care of it that I could. There was a big closet off the foyer in the front of the house. I carried the first box over there and I set it down. I opened the door, prepared to put the box of knickknacks in there. I picked up the box and stood up. I looked into the closet. My grandma was standing right there in the closet. She had a mean look on her face and she sternly shook her head no. Then she was gone. I nearly dropped the box, but I was lucky that I didn't. I was scared shitless. I realized I had just seen the ghost of my grandma and she didn't want me to put her knickknacks away.
Story 6. This is one of the weirdest things that has ever happened to me. My family lived out in the middle of nowhere, at least an hour drive into town. So, whenever the family wanted to go and visit relatives or friends, it took a long time to get anywhere. Of course, when I became a teenager, I had to stay home more often due to schoolwork. Or at least, that was the excuse that I used in order to get to remain home by myself. This was in the late fall. My parents and sister had gone out to visit my aunt and uncle. I stayed home to supposedly do homework. I can't honestly remember if I really had any to do or not, but that's not important. Our house was on the top of a hill. It was a beautiful place, too. The yard was huge, both in the front and back, but the front yard was much larger. The only thing, though, that we kept in the backyard was an old shed. It was an old wooden shed and seemed like it was older than the house was. There were even a lot of really old tools in it when we first moved in, but we never really used for it anything. I was watching TV and it was a little while after the sun had gone down. We had a dog at the time, a collie. I was sitting on the couch in the living room, and he had spent quite a bit of time sleeping at my feet. At one point though, the dog perked up. It caught my attention and I assumed that he had heard something. He was doing that thing that dogs do when they perceive something that we don't. He kept looking around a little bit too. After a few moments, the dog got up. He walked through the living room and then into the kitchen. The kitchen faced the backyard. There were sliding glass doors. I figured the pup just wanted to go outside and use the bathroom. So I got up and I walked over to the sliding glass door. I opened it up and let the dog out. He immediately started barking in what seemed like an aggressive way. I then closed the door and turned on the back porch light. Once I did, the dog kept barking. He wouldn't get off the porch though. I couldn't tell at first what he was barking at. Then, I noticed the scariest thing I had ever seen in my life. The door to the old shed swung open and a really big dude came out of it. He was carrying one of the old tools. It was a big pickaxe. I slid the door back open and called the dog in. The man looked over at us and watched us. He didn't move at first. It took a moment to get the dog to get into the house, but he finally came in. I locked the door, even though I knew that was a futile thing to do. If the guy wanted to break into the house, the pickaxe would easily destroy the window. I took the dog through the basement door. I locked that and we ran down the stairs. I began looking around to see if there was something I could use as a weapon. I had no idea who this guy was or why he was around, but the only thing that I could find in the basement to protect myself was a baseball bat. While I was getting the bat, I heard a crash from upstairs. It sounded like he broke down a regular door, though, and not the glass one. The sound was terrifying because there was now a huge guy with a pickaxe in my house. I tried hiding under the stairs with the dog and the bat. It didn't take long before he made his way over to the basement door, and then he began pounding on it and busted it open. I was scared that he was coming to kill me. "I know you're down there," he said in a big gruff voice. "The hex isn't for you, but you never saw me. Do you understand?" I was not able to reply. I just cowered with the dog. "You never saw me, do you understand? Answer me or I am coming down there." "I never saw you, I promise," I yelled back at him. There was a quiet moment. Then he answered back the words that I will never forget. "If you tell anyone you saw me, I'll come back for you." "I never saw you," I repeated. There was another quiet moment. "You better not forget it." 6 stories. I heard the man leave and he opened up the sliding glass door. I waited in the basement for a long time with the dog. I was too scared to come out of the basement. I didn't know if the guy had actually left or if he was messing with me. I had no idea, but I was terrified. When I eventually came up, there was very little damage to the house, but there was definitely no one there. I tried to clean up and lock up as good as possible. I thought that I should call 911, but I didn't. I hate to admit it, but I was just too scared by his threat. When my parents came home, I explained to them what happened. I was scared while we talked about it. I couldn't keep it from them because the house was damaged, but I didn't give them the best description either. As far as I know, nothing ever happened with the guy. There were no murders or break-ins reported that I heard of. I don't know why that guy wanted our pickaxe. I can only hope he didn't hurt anyone with it.